No, now it's 11. All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Claire Knutson-Latta. In the STA, I go by Kinnahild the Library. Dam Kinnahild. I'm a member of the Order of the Laurel and the Order of the Pelican for my crimes. And I'm here to talk to you today about runes as a system of orthography or writing rather than sort of runes as a mystical thing. So we're going to be doing a lot of linguistics. I'm going to try and keep things on an entry level, not get too technical, but if you have a little background in linguistics, it's very helpful. If you don't, totally cool. Also, this is the first time I've taught to a webcam, so it's a little weird for me. So I will do my best to reduce the filler words, but I'm learning with you. So if you've got the handout, you will note at the top that there's some writing in runes, and we're going to talk about why these different lines kind of break the rules. So the top line says this is really, I don't actually remember that. This is really wrong. This is still wrong. This too is, so too is this. So let's talk about some of the basic rules of runic orthography. Runes are not a coded version of the Latin alphabet. This is an alphabet. It is an alphabet. It's not an abjad, which is an alphabet that is a writing system that doesn't record vowels or syllabic. It does have some pictographic uses, not really pictographic, but sometimes the name of the rune can stand in for a word. So you'll see that in Anglo-Saxon poetry sometimes. But typically it is an alphabet. It's used, one character represents not one sound, but it can represent a range of sounds, and you have both nouns and consonants represented. But it's not a coded version of the Latin alphabet. So if you write something out using the Latin alphabet, so I should have started with a pen and paper handy, that would have been good. So if you write something out using the Latin alphabet, you can't then just letter for letter transcribe down to the runic alphabet. You also want to match age to age. So we're going to be talking about 3 different runic alphabets today. We're going to talk about Elder Futhark, Younger Futhark, and then Futhorc, which is the Anglo-Saxon alphabet. Elder Futhark is largely pre-Viking. So you'll see people use it a lot in a Viking Age context, but that's not really correct. It is sort of moving a little bit as we move into the early Viking Age. Usually they put that about 794. That's the rate on Lindisfarne. So you do see a little bit of bumping up to that, but largely it's the Elder Futhark has gone away. We'll be replacing it with the Younger Futhark. So Younger Futhark runs through the Viking Age, pretty much right up until the introduction of the Latin alphabet, introduction of Christianity, all that kind of stuff. And then the Anglo-Saxons were introduced to Christianity, or Old English. The English were introduced to Christianity much earlier than the Vikings, so they adopt the Latin alphabet much earlier, but they still use the Futhorc alphabet in various contexts, including things like the Frank's casket is decorated in runes. There's a couple of crosses that are decorated with a runic script, and then, as I mentioned, some of the poetry. So when you're producing like a scroll or something, if you're going to produce a scroll, you want to match the age of the alphabet with the age of the art. And at the end of the handout, I've given you a timeline of Viking Age art, so you can that kind of gives you an idea, and then Google the different types of the different art ages, and that'll give you a visual example of what you're looking for. Many of these rules aren't really rules, they're guidelines. You'll note there's no good grammar written during the Viking Age or during the Runic Age. That wasn't a thing. So these are rules that we've developed based on observation, rather than rules that they themselves kept track of. So aside from the runes aren't coded versions of the Latin alphabet and match age to age, these are all generally guidelines. Insert your Pirates of the Caribbean GIF here. So next up, use the thorn. There is a number of digraphs in English. Digraphs are 2 letters written together to represent a single sound, and you don't necessarily need to represent those digraphs in runic characters. The big one is th. Both the voiced TH is in this or the voiceless TH is in thin can be represented using the thorn. All three alphabets have a thorn. Super, it's a little, it's the sort of P with the long top. So use it, love it, become one with it. There's also a sort of diamond, and that's in, I believe, Elder Futhark, and that's an ng sound, so song. So you can use that there. Geminate symbols aren't really a thing. So a geminate here, Gemini, right, twins. So geminate means two symbols. So like really, the word really, R-E-A-L-L-Y, you would not use two runes to represent that LL, it would just be one. And that even happens across syllable boundaries. So think about largely carving these characters. They're carving them in stone, they're carving them in whalebone, as in the case of the Frank's casket. You don't want to carve more than you need to. So it's hard work, and frankly, every time you take chisel to material, you're risking ruining everything. So you're going to use as few characters as possible. So any geminate characters, just chuck them right out. In very early inscriptions, now we're going to get into some of the more technical stuff. Very early inscriptions, sort of the A sound in vacation, for those of us using a general American accent, Manitoba. I don't actually know how you pronounce vacation. So that A sound in vacation for American speakers can be rendered in runes with the runes representing an A and an I. When you're working with Elder Futhark or very early art. Later, you kind of, the pronunciation is going to change a little bit, so you can use an E and an I. There is no Y. Okay, so this is another very technical one. Nasals are frequently not written before homoorganic obstruents. Sorry, guys, I'm reading off my handout here. Homoorganic obstruents, meaning that if you have a nasal, so where the sound is coming out your nose, before an obstruent, which is any sound that's formed by obstructing the airflow, so that stops, like b, p, where you literally stop the air. Fricatives, where you're creating friction in the air, vibration, or affricates, which is like a ch, j, which I'm not going to try and explain simply. You don't necessarily have to write the nasal. I find it very tricky for somebody who's going back and trying to retranslate my runes back into English to understand what I've written on their scroll. If I leave those nasals out, there's always a question of like, is that really what that? I don't know. I don't. But if you're trying for technical correction, you can drop those nasals. And I've given you a little chart which nasal matches up to which obstruents. After the sound, some voiced consonants are written with an unvoiced symbol. So we're all now going to have a little fun with Linguistics 101. So this is a theme that has been mirrored in many linguistics classes I've attended. You're going to put your finger, find sort of where your voice box is as you're talking, put your fingers on it, and go zzz, zzz. So you're alternating Z's and S's, right? Zzz. And as you make the Z, zzz, you'll feel vibrations in your fingers. Zzz. And then as you make the S, those vibrations stop. So as you feel the vibrations, that is a voiced consonant. As you do not feel the vibrations, that's an unvoiced consonant. So Z, voiced, unvoiced. Congratulations. I'm hoping at home you guys have all also done the Z along with me. This is a classic linguistics class experience. Everybody in the room is making these noises. Everybody's got their fingers on their throat, and we all feel a little ridiculous. So welcome to my world. So as you make those sounds that you've now learned voiced versus unvoiced, so after an S, sometimes a voiced consonant. So other examples would be g or th, as in this, versus as in thin. Those are sometimes written with an unvoiced symbol. Now there's not always a differentiation using the runic alphabets between voiced and unvoiced. Sometimes those two sounds are carried on the same symbol. So be aware of that. But when there is a difference, you can choose to use the unvoiced version if you would like. So bringing it back to a little less complicated, writing direction isn't always fixed. There's a number of runestones where the writing goes up and down and up and down, and then after a while it goes back and forward, back and forward. And it can flip upside down. It can go right to left or left to right. There's a term in Greek called boustrophaedon, which literally means as the ox plows, which describes how sometimes you write one direction left to right, and then the next line you go right to left, and your characters sometimes even switch directions, so they become mirrored, and then you go back the other way. Less frequent is boustrophaedon, but generally they're following, especially with runestones, you're following the shape of the stone and trying to use the most space possible, and make the best use and most aesthetically pleasing use of space. So things to keep in mind. And then Futhorc, like as I mentioned before, Futhorc characters can occasionally appear with Latin characters. In those cases, they're often not just making the sound, but also the name of the rune is being used to represent a whole word. There's a great riddle poem in Old English where they do just that. And I like to imagine that somewhere the poet was just going snicker, snicker, snicker. I like to imagine a lot of snickering in history, because why not? So that's an option. I am not aware of any examples of this with younger Futhorc. I would not expect to see it at all with elder Futhorc. So if you're going to do this, consider doing it with Futhorc only. Make those decisions if you like. So some other things before we get into the specific alphabets, a couple of other exciting things that you can do with runes. You can make bind runes. So the best example, the most classic example of this that I have is the Bluetooth symbol. So if you're familiar with the connection protocol Bluetooth, you'll know that it's sort of a B shape with like a little thing coming off the back end. And that's the bind runes for H and B. It's a bind rune made of the two runes for H and B. And that's for Harald Bluetooth, who Bluetooth is named after. So a little trivia fun there. You can also do single stave runes. A single stave rune is where all the runes are connected on a single stave. So you'll have one line that goes across like this, and then the marks that make the individual runes off that single stave come up or down as necessary. There's a really great example of this where the runes are being used to represent the water under a ship, and it's on. So it makes up part of the ship, excuse me. It's SO 158 in Sweden and SO 352 also in Sweden. And then the waves under the ship is on DR 220 in Denmark. So it's just a neat way to use it. And it's something you can, especially if you're doing an art piece, something you consider playing with is how do you work the runes into the image themselves. It's not as complex as some of those beautiful Arabic images where the word and the image are one. And phenomenally beautiful calligraphy, but it's similar in concept a little bit, and something to consider trying. Sorry, also that I'm going really quickly. There's a little bit of nerves going on here, so we'll probably won't end up using the whole hour, is what I'm saying. Last is cipher or cryptographic runes, cryptic runes. There's a little bit more about these at the end of the handout, some visual examples, but basically what these are doing are they take the alphabet, they break it into three, they're called ats, and then you use the bars of the cipher rune to indicate, okay, this is in the first at, it's the third one over, the third character over in that at. And what it relies on is everybody to have some knowledge of what the standard ats are and how each one breaks up. Which not everybody appeared to agree on in periods, so there's something to think about. I think it's pretty cool. It's a neat way to send secret messages to your friends or something in a scroll. Branch runes are similar. The strokes are being attached to a vertical stem, and so you have tent runes, which are X's, and you use symbols coming off the X's. Branch runes, you have just a single bar, and you've got bits on this side, bits on this side. There's some visual examples of that in the handout towards the end of the handout. Encourage you to take a look. So I guess before I move on to the individual alphabets, does anybody have any questions? Watching the typing. I'm going to take a drink of my juice. All right, I'm not seeing anything, so plowing ahead. So the first alphabet we're going to talk about, we're going to do these by ages, essentially. First one we're going to talk about is Elder Futhark. Elder Futhark used to write Proto-Germanic, Proto-Norse, Gothic, Alemannic, Old High German, and Old Norse. Earliest inscription is from the Weimos Comb. It dates to about 160 CE. And throughout this, I'm going to use CE instead of AD, or CE and BCE instead of AD and BC, just because I like them. My mundane name starts with a C, so I like C. I don't know. Ignore me. Anyway, so earliest example, 160 CE, the Weimos Comb. The Kilvar stone in Sweden is from about 400 CE. It's notable as the earliest sequential listing of the runes. And this is something that I've always thought was kind of cool, is that alphabets and writing had a certain amount of magic power a little bit. And so you would sometimes just write out all the characters and say, you know what, I've put them all down in order. And it's neat to see that they're largely the order is agreed upon. So you just write them all down, and that adds its own kind of magic. And as somebody who does a lot of writing, that magic is kind of cool to me. So the Kilvar stone is the earliest sequential listing of the 24 runes of the Elder Futhark, again 400 CE. It was largely replaced, the Elder Futhark has become largely replaced by the Younger Futhark right about in the 8th century. So we talked about 794 is the start of the Viking Age. So you're seeing the Younger Futhark come into its own in the right about the same time as the start of the Viking Age. Eng, which is the diamond I was talking about, that is the digraph in English, NG, appears later in the life of Elder Futhark. Earlier it was an allophone of N, as it appeared before velars. So what this suggests is that they're probably pronouncing so a velar is a sound made kind of back here. It's like g, k, those sounds, those are velar sounds. So suggesting that the N before one of those sounds is probably already taking on that as it does sometimes in English. So if you think, as you say think, you've started to combine that N and the K in the back. Sing is already into the, anyway. The Z is often transcribed as a hard R. It's a sort of a small looking capital R. Earlier Germanic languages, Proto-Germanic, Gothic to a lesser extent, a lot of the Z was a very common sound and is frequently used in word endings. So that's the word we uses here is rhoticization. That's taking a Z or any sound and making it more R-like. So you're starting to see that in the Elder Futhark inscriptions, and that carries through into Old Norse. So by the time of Old Norse, so that's why you have like Ragnar or something like that, right? Instead of what you might see earlier. I don't know, actually, I'm not sure what the earlier version of Ragnar is. That was just the first word that came to mind. But earlier Proto-Germanic, there's a lot of Z endings. The 3-stroke S replaces the 4-stroke S towards the 5th century. So the 4-stroke S, again, wish I had a pen. I have a pencil. So that's the 4-stroke S. It looks to us like a Z, or an E, excuse me. And then that gets replaced with the 3-stroke S, which is sort of what we classically think of as the runic S, which I tend not to draw quite like that because that gets a little too SS to me. So I tend to draw mine kind of longer, sort of pulled out a little bit to give it a less Nazi-esque flair. So on this page of the handout, page 3, you've got a chart which gives you the runic image, the transliteration as typically seen, and then an IPA approximation. So really quickly, what IPA is it's the International Phonetic Alphabet, and it's a way that it's an alphabet that linguists use to try and describe sounds specifically. Instead of using like the Latin alphabet to transcribe different languages, linguists looked around and went, this is going to end poorly. And so we came up with a way to, each character represents only one sound and can be modified with various diacritics to further clarify what that sound is. But it's a way to be very, very specific about the sound that you're talking about. So at the end of this handout, there's an IPA chart for English, and I've tried to be as complete as possible. It is using a general American accent, so if you have a particularly strong, if you speak a particularly strong dialect of English, one of the southern dialects, parts of Canada, areas like the Northeast, your mileage may vary, and you're going to want to look up IPA for your particular dialect. But as I speak with a Northwest American dialect, Northwest American accent, but it's pretty close to General American. So that's what I used. So feel free to take a look at the runes. It's a little hard over this platform to go through one by one with them, so I'm not going to do that. What I would encourage you to do is at the top of the handout is my email address. Please, if you have any questions about transcriptions going forward, don't hesitate to email me. It may take me a day or two to get back to you, but I will get back with all alacrity. Also, feel free to friend me on Facebook. I am around to answer questions most of the time. So the next one we're going to talk about is Younger Futhark. Younger Futhark is the runes of the Viking Age. It was used to write Old West Norse, which is Old Norwegian and Old Icelandic, as well as Old East Norse, which is Swedish and Danish, Old Swedish and Old Danish. Knudsen, my family's Danish on my mother's side, and so we've all been trying to learn Danish using Duolingo. It's not going well for me. But one of the things that always kind of amuses me is when you have different Scandinavian language speakers. To an outsider, especially looking at the written language, it's all very mutually comprehensible, but they do not agree with you when you say that. And so Swedish and Danish are Eastern Norse languages. They're very closely related. If you ask a Swede if they can understand a Dane, they're going to say they speak with marbles in their mouths and they don't enunciate at all. And so they might not agree with me, but anyway. So it's used to, that was a digression. Used to write Old East Norse, Old West Norse, and that's about it. It evolved from Elder Futhark beginning around the 7th century and stabilized. It had largely stabilized by the 9th century. So 9th century, that's the 800s. Again, 794 started the Viking Age. So by the time the Viking Age really hit its swing, they were pretty much exclusively using Younger Futhark. There are significantly fewer characters, which makes transcriptions harder, especially if you transcribe into Younger Futhark and then back into English. A really good example of this is there's an event that I'm working on for November called Beyond PPF 2020. The PPF program project is Perfectly Period Feast. We're calling this a plausibly period feast, but it's going to take place in 10th century Scandinavia, southern Denmark. And so this beautiful art was made for us. There we go. You can't see it at all. That's not. All right. Anyway, so at the bottom it says Beyond the Wall, but it's transcribed very carefully into runes so that they're as correct as possible. And we've had a lot of people ask us what it says because they're like, Iant the Ooh. But so you just FYI. Fewer characters does make for a trickier transcription. You also have some differences between Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish runes. I've given you a little chart to compare the two underneath. There's some runes used specifically on the Isle of Gotland because that's what they do. Anyway, that's Younger Futhark. Again, take a look. You've got IPA as well as, I've tried to give you kind of not just the IPA representation, but what that sound represents in modern English. in General English, General American, good grief, and then sort of standard transliterations, and then the rune itself. So the last one we're going to talk about is Futhorc. Before I move on to that one, because that's a different language, does anybody have any questions? Okay, seeing none, we're on to our last alphabet. And this is kind of personally my favorite. Oh, wait. Yes, we do. LOL. Or is that a joke about the Swedish? Raya? Or Danish? I don't know. Hang on. Hope your guys' day is going well, by the way. We just got the hunker down order yesterday, so we're looking forward this week to not doing anything. All right, well, if that turns out to actually, oh, yeah, jokes. Gotcha. All right, so moving on then to Futhorc. So my former SCA name was Kunahild Kunasigasokter, which should give you a hint that I have a deep and abiding love of the Old English, the English people. I specifically studied Old English at university. I listen to Beowulf when I'm feeling sad. Like, this is my jam. So Futhorc is used to write Old English and Old Frisian. Frisian, by the way, is our closest relative. That's Friesland is, think, sort of northeastern Netherlands up to the Jutland Peninsula, which is the peninsula Denmark's on. So it's like looking at Europe, right? There's Denmark. It's sort of this region speaks Frisian. The Belgians, northern Belgium, northeastern, whatever. Anyway. Closest relative. If you are not sober and have some German and some Dutch and some Old English and speak English, you can largely understand Frisian, Friesk, because it all kind of works out. Or, you think you can understand it because you're not sober. Anyway, so used to write Old English and Old Frisian, beginning around the 5th century. It was used in England up until the 9th century, but not really it was an artistic language or an artistic alphabet. It wasn't a formal alphabet. They wrote all sorts of shit down. It's amazing. And they wrote it down largely using an insular minuscule script. So record keeping, all that kind of stuff was being done in Latin characters and the Latin language to a large extent. Runic characters were used for artistic expression. And almost exclusively used to represent Old English, not Latin. Beginning in the 7th century is when they kind of started switching from primarily runic to primarily Latin characters. The vowel sound ao is uncertain, so we're not really sure what that rune sounded like, as is the pronunciation of the rune Queorth. The vowel stan only appears once in Futhorc, and the letters Queorth and Eor appear only in ABC lists. So those are never used in complete inscriptions. They're only ever appear, at least to the best of our knowledge, in lists of the alphabet. Runes in the shaded section do not appear in the rune poem, but do appear elsewhere. Well, that was really handy of me to write because I didn't shade any of the boxes. So, my bad. When I'm transliterating English into runic characters and they don't want it necessarily in a scroll, somebody wants their thing in runes, I almost always try and convince them to go with this particular alphabet, with the Futhorc alphabet, because it was designed to write Old English. Old English does have a lot in common with modern English, despite the fact that our language has changed over the intervening millennia or so. So, nope, not a millennia. Yes, a millennia, more than a millennia. I do languages, not math. So, anyway, despite the fact that language has changed a lot over the years, it's still really Futhorc really is the best one for transcribing English, because it carries, you don't have the mess that you do when you're trying to make the jump to younger Futhorc. So that's the one I'd encourage you to use. It's also got, because they were writing everything under the sun down, and they largely, in a lot of cases, you'd have them write there'd be like in the runic poem, right? So there's Latin characters and then the runic characters. So we have a little bit better understanding of what those sounds were. So it's also got a number of runic digraphs that appear in in Futhorc, and I've given you a list of those below. So if you want to make the sound j, like in judge, there is a digraph that represents that sound, which makes life a lot easier. So that's kind of it for what I've got in terms of the 3 alphabets that I wanted to talk about. Your handout is going to provide you a lot of information that I haven't covered in the discussion part of it, because this class wasn't really designed just to be a lecture. It was supposed to be like lecture and then some practice and some playing with it. So we're adapting and overcoming. In the rest of your handout, you'll find a very long list of IPA sounds and where they appear, how it appears in different parts of a word, what that IPA symbol is, how to make some sense of that. If you want to hear each of the sounds, especially if you don't speak with a general American accent, you want to make sure that you're understanding what that symbol represents in terms of the sound. Actually, Wikipedia has a really good system they have an IPA for English Wikipedia page, and they've got little audio clips of each of the different sounds. So if you're confused about that stuff, I would really encourage you to look it up online, listen to the sounds yourself, and make sure that that's the sound that you're trying to achieve. To a certain extent, if the sound didn't exist for them, you're not going to be able to make an exact reproduction of it using runic characters. So make your best guess, get as close as you can. Honestly, Ophir, so we don't know many rune writers' names, but one of the few that we do know is likely a man named Ophir, O-P-I-R. So every so often in my head, I'm like, would Ophir judge me for doing this? And the reality is he's been dead for a long time. So maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. He'd probably be really judgy. Maybe not. Maybe he's a chill dude. I don't know. Anyway, so there's an IPA list, some information about that. There's a timeline for Norse animal styles, which is really Norse art styles, and that'll take you through everything from Bora and Yelling, Mammon, Ringrika, all these different styles, so you can match the age of your runes to the style of the art in a way that'll help. And then you've got some tables for Elder Futhorc and Younger Futhorc. To the best of my knowledge, Futhorc never appears in cryptic runes, so I haven't included an table for that. And then there's some practice options if you want to practice those. If you want to see how you did with your practice, feel free to take a snapshot and send it to me, and I will write back with and then any corrections, because awesome. If you want to practice, that's awesome, and that makes me really happy. So, and then some resources at the end if you want some more information. Like I said at the beginning, I'm here to help. Feel free to friend me on Facebook or send me an email. I've given you my email at the top of the handout. I haven't given you my phone number, so please don't call me. If you do, I'm going to be really creeped out. But all in all, I hope you've enjoyed these 34 minutes. I wish we could have all met at Gulf Wars, but stay safe, stay healthy, and keep learning.